The flames that consumed Oakwood Plantation on that October night in 1860 weren't started by accident or by raiders from the north. They were deliberately set by a man who had returned to Georgia after 15 years of freedom with enough money to buy his elderly mother out of bondage, only to discover that she had been dead for 12 years, worked to death in the cotton fields, while he had been building a fortune in California, believing that patience and wealth would eventually allow him to save her. The man who stood watching the plantation house burn with its owners trapped inside wasn't the terrified 17-year-old who had fled north in 1845. He was a 32-year-old businessman worth over $200, Sergio Ziron, who had discovered that all his years of sacrifice and accumulation had been for nothing, and who had decided in that moment of devastating revelation that if he couldn't save his mother, he would at least ensure that the people who had killed her would never profit from another human being's suffering. If you're ready to discover the most devastating story of delayed revenge in American history, where a man who escaped slavery and became wealthy through years of sacrifice returned to buy his mother's freedom, only to find she was dead, and responded by systematically destroying the plantation and everyone responsible for her death. Hit that subscribe button right now, give this video a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because what happened when wealth met grief? When patient planning met the discovery that you're 15 years too late, and when a free black man with resources decided that some injustices can only be answered with total annihilation, will challenge everything you thought you knew about revenge, justice, and the terrible price of freedom that comes too late to save the people you love most. The journey that had brought this man, who had been born into slavery as simply Boy Tom but who now went by the name Thomas Freeman, from barefoot field hand to wealthy California merchant, had been marked by extraordinary determination, sacrifice, and the singular focus on accumulating enough money to purchase his mother's freedom, legally, rather than through the dangerous uncertainty of helping her escape. Thomas had spent 15 years building his fortune $1 at a time, working gold fields in California, where a black man's money was as good as anyone's, investing in businesses during San Francisco's boom years, and living with brutal frugality that allowed him to save amounts that would have seemed impossible to anyone who hadn't been driven by love for a mother left behind in Georgia's cotton hell. The year was 1860, and Georgia stood on the precipice of a civil war that would destroy the very economic system Thomas had spent 15 years accumulating wealth to navigate legally. The state's cotton economy had reached its peak of profitability, producing wealth that enriched plantation owners, while enslaved people worked under conditions so brutal that life expectancy in the fields was measured in years rather than decades. The political tensions between North and South had created an atmosphere where any challenge to slavery was viewed as existential threat, where free black people were viewed with suspicion, regardless of their wealth or legal status, and where a man like Thomas Freeman represented everything that white Georgians feared, proof that black people could succeed when given freedom, and a living challenge to every justification slavery's defenders had constructed. Oakwood Plantation sprawled across 8,000 acres of prime cotton land in central Georgia's Piedmont region, its boundaries marked by the Oconee River on one side and endless cotton fields on the other. The plantation house, a Greek revival mansion with 6 white columns and sprawling wings that had been added as the family's wealth grew, stood as monument to 4 generations of systematic human exploitation disguised as agricultural enterprise. The property was owned by the Whitmore family, Master James Whitmore, 59 years old and 3rd-generation owner, his wife Elizabeth, 55 and the plantation's iron-fisted mistress, and their 2 adult sons who managed field operations with a brutality that exceeded even their father's standards. Thomas Freeman had been born on Oakwood in 1828, the son of a woman named Sarah, who had been purchased specifically for her strength and her proven capacity to produce children who could be raised as future laborers. His earliest memories involved his mother's hands, calloused and scarred from decades of cotton picking, but gentle when they touched his face, strong when they held him during the brief hours between exhausting field work and the inadequate sleep that had to sustain her for the next day's labor. Sarah had taught her son to read in secret using a Bible she had stolen from the plantation house, understanding that literacy might someday provide opportunities that ignorance never could, and had drilled into him the importance of surviving, of staying alive no matter what happened, because the dead couldn't fight and couldn't someday find freedom. The relationship between Thomas and his mother had been the defining force of his first 17 years, providing the love and purpose that allowed him to survive conditions designed to break human spirits. Sarah had protected him when possible, had taken punishments meant for him when she could, and had given him the psychological foundation that would later allow him to not merely survive freedom, but to thrive in it. The bond between them had been forged in conditions where family ties were constantly threatened by sale, separation, and death, making it stronger and more precious than relationships formed in circumstances where permanence could be assumed. The specific cruelty that the Whitmore family had inflicted upon Thomas and Sarah over the years had been both routine, the everyday brutality of slavery that required no special malice, and exceptionally personal, as Elizabeth Whitmore had developed a particular hostility towards Sarah that manifested in systematic attempts to break her spirit through targeting her son. When Thomas was 10, Elizabeth had ordered him whipped for the crime of learning to read, administering the punishment herself while forcing Sarah to watch. When he was 13, she had threatened to sell him away if Sarah didn't work faster in the fields, using the threat of permanent separation as motivation that proved more effective than any physical torture. The decision that had led to Thomas's escape in 1845 had been forced by the discovery that he was indeed about to be sold to a slave trader from Alabama who specialized in purchasing young male slaves for resale to the brutal sugar and rice plantations of Louisiana, where life expectancy was measured in single-digit years. Sarah had learned of the impending sale through the slave quarters intelligence network and had made the hardest decision of her life. She had told her 17-year-old son that he needed to escape immediately, that his survival was more important than staying together, and that if he lived and somehow found freedom and fortune, perhaps he could someday return to buy her out of bondage through legal means that wouldn't result in his death or re-enslavement. The escape itself had been terrifying and nearly fatal, as Thomas had fled north using the Underground Railroad, while slave catchers with dogs pursued escapees throughout Georgia. The journey had taken 3 months and had brought him closer to death than anything he had experienced in slavery. Hunger, exposure, the constant terror of capture, and the knowledge that if he were caught, the punishment would be so severe that death might be preferable. But he had survived through a combination of luck, help from strangers both black and white who risked everything to assist escaping slaves, and the fierce determination that came from his mother's final words. You live, you get free, you make something of yourself, and maybe, if God allows it, you come back for me someday when you got the means to do it right. The 15 years that followed Thomas's arrival in California had been marked by sacrifice, determination, and singular focus on accumulating wealth that would allow him to fulfill his promise to return for his mother. He had arrived in San Francisco during the early years of the gold rush, when fortunes were being made and lost daily, and when a black man's origins mattered less than his capacity to work and his willingness to take risks. Thomas had worked in the gold fields initially, but had quickly recognized that the real money wasn't in mining, but in providing services to miners. He had opened a laundry service, then a restaurant, then had invested in real estate during San Francisco's explosive growth. The fortune that Thomas had accumulated through 15 years of brutal work and careful investment had exceeded his wildest expectations when he first arrived in California. By 1860, he was worth over $200,000, an enormous sum equivalent to millions in modern currency, and owned property throughout San Francisco, shares in multiple businesses, and investments that generated income without requiring his constant labor. He had achieved the kind of success that was supposed to be impossible for a former slave, had proven through his accomplishments that enslaved people's supposed inferiority was a lie designed to justify their bondage, and had finally accumulated enough wealth to not merely purchase his mother's freedom, but to ensure she would live out her remaining years in comfort. The preparation for his return to Georgia had involved careful planning and legal consultation, as Thomas understood that a free black man with significant wealth traveling through the slave South faced dangers that no amount of money could fully protect against. He had obtained certified documents proving his free status, had hired a white lawyer from Philadelphia to accompany him and handle the legal aspects of purchasing his mother, and had brought enough cash to pay whatever price the Whitmores might demand, plus additional funds to bribe any officials who might create obstacles. The journey south had felt like returning to a nightmare he had spent 15 years trying to forget, but the vision of reuniting with his mother and lifting her out of bondage had sustained him through every moment of anxiety and fear. The arrival at Oakwood Plantation on that October afternoon had been marked by a confidence born of 15 years of freedom and success as Thomas approached the plantation house in a fine suit with his lawyer beside him, carrying documents and cash that represented his transformation from property into person, with legal standing and economic power. He had rehearsed this moment hundreds of times in his imagination. The surprise on the Whitmores' faces when they realized that the slave boy they had sold had returned as a wealthy man, the negotiation over Sarah's purchase price, the joy of seeing his mother's face when she understood that her suffering was finally ending, the journey back to California, where she would spend her remaining years in the freedom and comfort she had earned through decades of brutal labor. What Thomas actually encountered when he knocked on Oakwood's front door would shatter every plan he had made and every hope he had sustained through 15 years of sacrifice. The conversation with James Whitmore that followed, conducted in the plantation office where Thomas had once been whipped for the crime of literacy, revealed truths that transformed accumulated grief into immediate fury and patient planning into the decision to destroy everything the Whitmores had built upon his mother's suffering and the suffering of hundreds of other enslaved people whose lives had been consumed to produce the wealth that surrounded them. "Your boy Tom," Whitmore had said with a mixture of surprise and contempt when Thomas introduced himself by his chosen name. "The one who ran off in 45. You got nerve coming back here, I'll give you that. What do you want?" "I've come to purchase my mother's freedom," Thomas had responded, maintaining the careful control he had developed over 15 years of navigating a world where showing anger could be fatal for a black man regardless of his wealth. "I have cash and I have a lawyer. I'm prepared to pay fair market value plus a premium. I just want to buy her freedom and take her north where she can live out her remaining years in peace." The silence that followed had been long enough for Thomas to notice details he hadn't registered in his initial focus on accomplishing his mission. Whitmore's expression had shifted from contempt to something approaching discomfort, and behind him, Elizabeth Whitmore had appeared in the doorway with a look that combined hostility with what might have been guilt if such people were capable of that emotion. "Boy Tom," Whitmore had said slowly, using the slave name deliberately to reassert dominance over someone whose free status and evident wealth challenged fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy. "Your mother died 12 years ago, 1848, worked herself to death in the cotton fields during a particularly brutal harvest season. We buried her in the slave cemetery with the others." The words had landed like physical blows, each one destroying another piece of the carefully constructed hope that had sustained Thomas through 15 years of sacrifice. 12 years ago, 1848, just 3 years after his escape, dead, while he had been building his fortune in California, believing that wealth would allow him to save her. Worked to death in the fields while he had been opening businesses and making investments and planning for a reunion that would never happen. All those years of sacrifice, all that accumulated wealth, all those nights spent imagining her joy when he returned, rendered meaningless by the casual brutality of a system that had killed her and buried her in an unmarked grave, while he had been working to earn enough money to buy her freedom through legal means that arrived 15 years too late. "You worked her to death," Thomas had said quietly, his voice carrying a flatness that indicated emotion too profound for normal expression. "You knew I might come back someday with money to buy her, and you worked her to death anyway because she was just property to you, just a tool to be used up and discarded. 15 years I spent building a fortune to save her. 15 years she suffered here, while I was trying to accumulate enough to buy her legally. And you killed her 3 years after I left." The confrontation that followed as Thomas's grief transformed into rage and his carefully maintained control began to crack would set in motion events that would destroy Oakwood Plantation and shock Georgia society by demonstrating that sometimes the most devastating revenge comes not from those who have nothing left to lose, but from those who have everything and discover that all their achievements mean nothing because they came too late to save the person they were meant for. Block 2. Development 3. 0 words. The 15 years that Thomas Freeman had spent building his fortune in California, while his mother suffered and died in Georgia, represented one of history's cruelest ironies. Every dollar he accumulated toward her eventual freedom was earned during years when she was being worked to death in cotton fields. Every business success he celebrated occurred while she endured conditions that were systematically destroying her body. And every night he spent imagining their reunion was a night she spent in quarters that provided no protection from Georgia's climate extremes or from the exhaustion that was aging her decades beyond her actual years. The parallel timelines of his rising prosperity and her declining health would haunt Thomas for the rest of his life. But in the immediate aftermath of discovering she had been dead for 12 years, those parallel timelines fueled a rage so profound that it would transform careful planning and legal methods into the decision to destroy Oakwood Plantation and everyone responsible for Sarah's death. The journey north that had begun Thomas's transformation from enslaved teenager to free California businessman had been marked by near-death experiences and moments of grace that seemed almost miraculous given the dangers faced by escaping slaves in 1845. The Underground Railroad route through Georgia, Tennessee, and Kentucky had brought him into contact with conductors both black and white who risked everything to assist people seeking freedom. Families who sheltered him in hidden rooms and cellars, and Quakers whose religious convictions about slavery's evil translated into practical assistance that saved his life multiple times. The 3-month journey had taught Thomas that some white people recognized slavery as the moral abomination it was, and were willing to act on that recognition despite the legal and social consequences. The arrival in Philadelphia in early 1846 had marked Thomas's first experience of something approaching freedom, though he quickly learned that northern states offered only partial liberation from the racial hierarchies that defined American society. Free black communities in Philadelphia had provided initial support and guidance, helping him find work and teaching him to navigate a world where he possessed legal personhood, but still faced systematic discrimination and the constant threat of slave catchers who operated in northern cities seeking escapees to return south for bounties. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that Thomas was never truly safe in the eastern states, a reality that would eventually drive him to seek the more complete freedom that California's distance from slavery's heartland seemed to offer. The decision to join the migration to California during the gold rush had been motivated by both the promise of opportunity and the need for distance from slave catchers, whose reach extended throughout the eastern seaboard. Thomas had worked his passage on a ship around Cape Horn, enduring months of dangerous ocean travel in exchange for transportation to San Francisco, where he arrived in late 1846 with no money, no connections, and nothing but the determination his mother had instilled in him and the literacy she had risked everything to provide. The San Francisco he encountered was a chaotic boomtown where traditional social hierarchies were temporarily disrupted by the scramble for wealth, creating openings for a young black man with intelligence and work ethic to establish himself in ways that would have been impossible in more settled societies. The early years in California had been marked by brutal labor and extreme frugality as Thomas worked in gold fields alongside men from around the world, learning that while racism certainly existed in California, money had a way of commanding respect that transcended some social barriers. He had quickly recognized that the real fortunes were being made not by miners, but by those who provided services to miners, the merchants, launderers, restaurant owners, and boarding house operators who extracted steady income from men whose gold-strike fortunes were usually temporary. Thomas had saved every penny he could from his mining wages, living in conditions barely better than slavery, in order to accumulate the capital needed to start his first business. The laundry service that Thomas opened in 1848, the same year his mother died in Georgia's cotton fields, had been built on the recognition that miners would pay premium prices for clean clothes and that most men lacked the time or inclination to do their own washing. He had worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week, taking on volumes of laundry that would have broken weaker men, and had reinvested every dollar of profit into expanding the business rather than improving his own living conditions. The success of that first venture had provided capital for a restaurant that served miners who were willing to pay inflated prices for hot meals, and that success had funded investments in San Francisco real estate during the early years, when property could be acquired cheaply before the city's explosive growth made land itself more valuable than gold. The fortune that Thomas had accumulated by 1860 represented not just financial success, but vindication of his mother's sacrifice in teaching him to read, and her insistence that he survive and make something of himself. The $200 he had amassed, equivalent to perhaps $6 million in modern currency, came from multiple sources: the laundry and restaurant businesses that generated steady income, real estate investments that had appreciated enormously as San Francisco grew from frontier town to major city, and shares in various enterprises, ranging from shipping to banking. He had become one of the wealthiest black men in California, proof that when freed from slavery's constraints, black people could achieve success that matched or exceeded what white Americans accomplished with similar opportunities. But every dollar Thomas earned had been earned with his mother in mind. Every business decision made with the goal of accumulating enough wealth to purchase her freedom legally and ensure she could live her remaining years in comfort rather than bondage. He had maintained correspondence with other freed slaves who had escaped from Georgia, gathering information about conditions at Oakwood Plantation and about his mother's situation. The letters he received, written by others since Sarah herself could only read, not write, had assured him that she was alive and still working in the fields, that the Whitmores had not sold her away, and that if he could accumulate sufficient funds, purchase might be possible since James Whitmore was known to occasionally sell slaves to free relatives who could pay premium prices. What Thomas hadn't known, what the letters hadn't told him because the writers themselves might not have known, or might have thought the information too devastating to convey, was that Sarah had died in 1848 after the Whitmores had driven field workers at brutal pace during a harvest season where cotton prices were particularly high. The details of her death that Thomas would eventually piece together from conversations with enslaved people still living at Oakwood would reveal that she had collapsed in the fields from heat exhaustion and overwork, had been carried to the quarters where she died within hours without receiving medical care, and had been buried in an unmarked grave in the slave cemetery, where 4 generations of enslaved people's bodies had been deposited without ceremony or recognition. The parallel timeline of Sarah's final years and Thomas's rising success represented a tragedy of missed connections and the cruel mathematics of accumulating wealth slowly while someone you love is being destroyed quickly. In 1846, when Thomas was working his passage to California, Sarah was still relatively healthy, despite decades of field labor. In 1847, when he was mining gold, she was beginning to show signs of the physical decline that brutal work accelerated in enslaved people who never received adequate nutrition, rest, or medical care. In 1848, when he was opening his laundry business and celebrating his first taste of entrepreneurial success, she was dying in a cotton field while he was 3, so 0 miles away making money he believed would eventually save her. By 1849, when his business was thriving and he was beginning to accumulate serious wealth, she had been in the ground for a year. The years between 1848 and 1860 represented Thomas's continued accumulation of wealth toward a goal that had already become impossible without his knowledge, a tragic example of how information traveled slowly in the 19th century, and how the lack of reliable communication between California and Georgia meant that he could continue working toward reunion with a mother who had been dead for over a decade. The letters he had received from Georgia had been written by people who either didn't know about Sarah's death or who had confused her with another enslaved woman of the same name, or who had simply told Thomas what they thought he needed to hear to maintain his hope and his determination to succeed. The cruelty that the Whitmore family had inflicted upon Sarah during her final years had been both systematic and personal, as Elizabeth Whitmore had never forgiven her for the crime of having produced a son who had escaped successfully, and whose absence represented a financial loss and a challenge to the plantation's system of total control. The mistress had made Sarah's life particularly miserable after Thomas's escape, assigning her to the hardest field labor despite her age, reducing her food rations as punishment for her son's rebellion, and making casual comments about how Thomas had abandoned his mother to save himself, psychological torture designed to break Sarah's spirit by suggesting that her sacrifice in encouraging his escape had been betrayed. But Sarah had maintained her dignity and her pride in her son, despite the increased brutality, telling other enslaved people that Thomas had escaped to freedom as she had urged him to do, that he was making something of himself in the North, as she had insisted he must, and that perhaps someday he would return to help others as he had been helped. She had never expressed regret about encouraging his escape or resentment that he had survived while she continued to suffer, understanding that his freedom was victory, even if it came without her liberation. The other enslaved people at Oakwood had respected Sarah for her strength and had tried to help her during her final years, sharing their food rations and covering for her when her declining physical capacity made it difficult to maintain the brutal work pace the Whitmores demanded. The specific circumstances of Sarah's death in 1848 had been witnessed by several enslaved people who were still living at Oakwood in 1860 and who would share the details with Thomas during the evening after he learned she was dead. They described how she had been working in the cotton fields during the hottest part of a brutally hot day, how she had stumbled and fallen, but had been forced to continue working by an overseer who threatened whipping if she didn't maintain pace, and how she had finally collapsed completely and been carried to the quarters where she had died within hours, despite the efforts of the plantation's elderly healer to save her with herbal remedies that were inadequate for treating heat stroke and complete physical exhaustion in a body that had been systematically depleted by decades of brutal labor and inadequate nutrition. What made Sarah's death particularly tragic was the knowledge that it had been preventable if the Whitmores had allowed her to rest when she first showed signs of distress, if they had provided adequate water and shade during the hottest part of the day, if they had reduced her workload in recognition of her age and declining physical capacity, she might have survived. But the economic calculations of slavery meant that enslaved people's lives were valued only in terms of their labor productivity, and a woman in her late 50s who was slowing down was viewed as a depreciating asset to be extracted for whatever remaining value she possessed, rather than as a human being deserving of basic care and consideration. The burial that had followed Sarah's death had been typical of how enslaved people were disposed of at Oakwood and throughout the South. Her body had been wrapped in cheap cloth and buried in a shallow grave in the slave cemetery, without marker, ceremony, or any recognition of the life she had lived or the son she had raised or the sacrifices she had made. The Whitmores had not attended or acknowledged her death beyond noting it in their plantation records as the loss of one aging female slave of minimal remaining economic value. No one had tried to notify Thomas in California because no one had his address or any way to contact him, and even if they had, the Whitmores would not have considered it necessary to inform an escaped slave that his mother had died. The discovery of these details during Thomas's first evening at Oakwood, learned through conversations with enslaved people who remembered his mother and who were initially terrified that this well-dressed black man might be working with the Whitmores to identify potential escapees, transformed his grief into a cold rage that would drive everything he did over the following days. The realization that his mother had died 12 years earlier was devastating enough, but learning the specific circumstances of her death, understanding that it had been preventable, and recognizing that the Whitmores had literally worked her to death without concern for her humanity, created a moral clarity about what justice required. The legal options that Thomas had carefully prepared for, purchasing his mother's freedom through the white lawyer he had brought from Philadelphia, using his wealth to navigate the system legally, became irrelevant the moment he learned she was dead. But the wealth he had accumulated and the resources he had assembled for a peaceful transaction could be redirected toward a very different purpose: the complete destruction of Oakwood Plantation and the Whitmore family, accomplished through methods that would ensure they suffered, as his mother had suffered, and that the plantation built on her labor, and the labor of hundreds like her, would never produce another dollar of profit from human bondage. The planning that Thomas began during that first terrible night at Oakwood involved both practical logistics and moral reckoning as he grappled with the question of what justice looked like when earthly law provided no accountability for the people who had killed his mother. The obvious answer, simply burning the plantation house with the Whitmores inside, would be satisfying but insufficient, a crude violence that would fail to communicate the full scope of his rage or the specific nature of their crimes. Thomas wanted something more comprehensive, something that would destroy not just buildings and lives, but the entire economic and social system the Whitmores represented. The resources Thomas had available for his revenge campaign were considerable and unusual for any black man in 1860, free or enslaved. He had $5 Zoysia in cash with him, more than most white plantation owners would see in a lifetime, plus access to much larger sums in California banks if needed. He had the services of a white lawyer who, while initially horrified by Thomas's shift from legal purchase to revenge planning, could be convinced to assist or at least not interfere. Most importantly, he had knowledge of business, property, and economics that 15 years of success in California had provided, understanding of how systems worked that would allow him to identify vulnerabilities that simple violence would miss. If this story of wealth accumulated too late to save the person it was meant for has you gripped and desperate to know how Thomas's grief transforms into a revenge campaign that will destroy everything the Whitmores built on his mother's suffering, make sure you hit that like button right now to support these extraordinary tales of justice. delivered by those who returned with resources their oppressors never imagined they could acquire. Subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss these deep dives into the most shocking true stories, where delayed revenge proved more devastating than immediate violence. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and whether 15 years of patient wealth accumulation can ever compensate for arriving too late to save the person you love. I read every comment and love hearing your perspectives on these complex moral questions. The stage was set for a revenge campaign that would prove that sometimes the most devastating destruction comes not from those with nothing left to lose, but from those with everything, and the terrible knowledge that all their success means nothing because it came 15 years too late. The systematic destruction of Oakwood Plantation that Thomas Freeman orchestrated over the following week demonstrated that 15 years of business experience and accumulated wealth could be weaponized more effectively than simple violence, as he used his resources and knowledge to not merely kill the Whitmore family, but to methodically dismantle every aspect of their economic and social power before setting fire to everything they had built upon his mother's suffering and the suffering of hundreds of other enslaved people whose bodies had been consumed to produce cotton profits. The revenge campaign that unfolded would shock Georgia society not just because of its effectiveness, but because it proved that a free black man with resources could destroy a powerful white family through patient strategic action that exploited every vulnerability in the system that had enriched them. The first phase of Thomas's destruction involved economic warfare that began the morning after he learned of his mother's death, as he used his cash reserves and his business knowledge to systematically undermine the Whitmore family's financial foundation. Georgia's economy in 1860 operated on credit systems where plantation owners borrowed against future cotton crops, maintaining their lifestyle through loans from factors and merchants who advanced money in exchange for exclusive rights to sell their cotton. Thomas spent that first day visiting every merchant and factor who had business relationships with the Whitmores, using his wealth to pay off their loans at premium prices in exchange for immediate transfer of debt obligations to himself, effectively making him the Whitmore family's primary creditor, with the legal power to call in those debts. The shocked reactions of Georgia merchants, who found themselves negotiating with a wealthy black man rather than conducting business as usual, revealed both the power of money to temporarily override social hierarchies and the profound discomfort white Southerners felt when confronted with black economic success. Thomas conducted these transactions through his Philadelphia lawyer when necessary to overcome merchants' reluctance to deal directly with a black man, but he made sure his role was visible and understood, forcing acknowledgement that the money-changing hands came from a former slave who had returned with resources that exceeded what most white planters could command. By the end of that first day, Thomas owned approximately $30 in Whitmore family debts, loans against future cotton crops, outstanding accounts with merchants for supplies and equipment, and various other financial obligations that plantation operations required. The legal documents he now possessed gave him the power to demand immediate repayment of sums the Whitmores couldn't possibly raise quickly, creating a financial crisis that would force them to sell property, enslaved people, or the plantation itself to meet obligations they had expected to repay gradually through future cotton sales. The second phase involved destroying the Whitmore family's social standing through strategic deployment of information that would turn Georgia society against them, as Thomas used his wealth to hire investigators who uncovered evidence of financial improprieties, tax evasion, and various other crimes that plantation owners routinely committed, but which could be devastating if publicly exposed. The particular vulnerability that investigators discovered involved James Whitmore's systematic underreporting of cotton production to avoid taxes, a common practice among planters, but one that constituted fraud against the state of Georgia, and which could result in massive fines, property seizure, and potential imprisonment if documented and reported to authorities. Thomas had copies of Whitmore's actual production records compared against his tax filings prepared by accountants in Atlanta, creating documentary evidence of tax fraud spanning 15 years that represented tens of thousands of dollars in unpaid obligations to the state. He arranged for this information to be delivered anonymously to Georgia's tax authorities and simultaneously to newspapers in Atlanta and Savannah, ensuring that the scandal would become public knowledge that would destroy the Whitmore family's reputation even if legal penalties were somehow avoided through political connections. The third phase targeted the Whitmore family's sons, who managed field operations and whose brutality toward enslaved workers exceeded even their father's standards. Through a combination of legal action and street justice that demonstrated Thomas's willingness to deploy violence when economic and legal methods weren't sufficient. The older son had a documented history of beating enslaved people to death, murders that went unpunished in a legal system that didn't recognize enslaved people as fully human. But Thomas used his resources to hire investigators who could document these killings and create pressure for prosecution even in Georgia's pro-slavery legal environment. But Thomas understood that Georgia law would never truly hold white men accountable for killing enslaved people, so he supplemented legal pressure with more direct methods. He hired men from Atlanta's free black community, hardened individuals who had survived in hostile environments and who were willing to deliver physical justice that law wouldn't provide, and gave them instructions to find the Whitmore sons in town and deliver beatings severe enough to hospitalize them, but calculated to avoid murder that would bring full legal consequences down on everyone involved. The attacks on the Whitmore sons occurred on successive nights in Milledgeville, where they had gone to drink and visit brothels, confident that their social position protected them from consequences. The beatings were savage and methodical, conducted by multiple attackers who disappeared into the night before authorities could respond, leaving both sons broken and bleeding in alleys with messages carved into their flesh that read, "For Sarah," and "This is justice." The incidents created panic among Georgia's planter class as they realized that wealthy, free black people could hire agents to deliver violence that challenged assumptions about white physical safety, and that money could purchase revenge even in the heart of the slave South. The fourth phase of Thomas's revenge campaign involved direct action to help enslaved people at Oakwood escape, using his resources to fund and organize the most ambitious underground railroad operation ever conducted in central Georgia. Over the course of a week, Thomas used his cash to bribe overseers, pay off patrol guards, and arrange transportation for nearly 100 enslaved people who wanted to escape. Basically anyone at Oakwood who was young and healthy enough to survive the journey north. He hired conductors from the Underground Railroad network, purchased wagons and supplies, and coordinated movements that would get escapees out of Georgia before authorities could organize effective pursuit. The mass escape that occurred over 3 nights in mid-October 1860 was unprecedented in its scale and organization, as families who had lived at Oakwood for generations suddenly found themselves being offered the chance to flee to freedom with all expenses paid and protection provided by a wealthy black man who had returned specifically to destroy the plantation that had killed his mother. Not everyone chose to leave. Some elderly people felt too fragile for the dangerous journey. Some people had family ties they couldn't abandon, and some simply couldn't overcome the psychological conditioning that made escape seem impossible, even when offered freely. But approximately 90 people did leave, guided by Underground Railroad conductors whom Thomas had paid premium rates to ensure maximum safety and attention. The economic impact on Oakwood was devastating, as the Whitmores suddenly lost a significant portion of their labor force just as harvest season approached, and the psychological impact on Georgia's planter class was even more profound, as they grappled with the realization that wealth could be used to systematically strip them of their enslaved property through organized escape operations that their patrol systems couldn't prevent when properly funded and coordinated. The fifth phase involved destroying Oakwood's physical infrastructure in ways that would make recovery impossible, even if the Whitmores somehow survived the financial and legal attacks Thomas had already launched. Over several nights, Thomas and allies he had recruited from free black communities destroyed critical equipment and buildings, burning cotton gins that couldn't be quickly replaced, sabotaging irrigation systems that had been built over generations, contaminating stored cotton with materials that would make it unsellable, and generally ensuring that even if the Whitmores retained legal ownership of the land, they would lack the capacity to operate it profitably. The sabotage was conducted with the kind of strategic precision that came from Thomas's business understanding of plantation operations, targeting bottleneck systems whose destruction would cascade into broader operational failures. The loss of the cotton gin alone represented a catastrophic blow because replacement would take months and would require capital the Whitmores no longer had access to, while destruction of stored cotton that was supposed to be sold to pay debts created immediate financial crisis that Thomas's debt ownership allowed him to exploit by demanding immediate payment. The climactic phase of Thomas's revenge campaign came on the 7th night after his arrival, when he decided that economic destruction wasn't sufficient and that the Whitmore family needed to die for what they had done to his mother, not through covert action that might be investigated, but through fire that would consume them, along with the plantation house that symbolized everything they had built on enslaved people's suffering. The decision to commit murder represented a moral line that Thomas had been wrestling with throughout the week, understanding that killing the Whitmores would mean he could never return to his California life, but feeling with increasing certainty that justice for his mother's death required their deaths. The preparation for the fire involved ensuring that everyone Thomas wanted to save, the enslaved people who had remained at Oakwood, staff who had shown kindness to his mother, anyone who wasn't responsible for her death, would be safely away from the plantation house when the fire started. Thomas spread word through trusted intermediaries that everyone should stay in the quarters that evening, that something was going to happen at the main house, and that anyone who stayed away would be safe while anyone in the house would face consequences they couldn't escape. The confrontation with the Whitmore family before Thomas set the fire represented his need to make them understand exactly why they were about to die and to force them to acknowledge what they had done, even if they wouldn't admit guilt or express remorse. He entered the plantation house in the evening while the family was at dinner, walking into the dining room with a pistol in one hand and a container of kerosene in the other, his appearance causing Elizabeth Whitmore to scream and James Whitmore to reach for a weapon he kept nearby for exactly such emergencies. "Don't," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that came from being armed, wealthy, and completely certain about what he was about to do. "I'm not here to debate or to give you a chance to explain. I'm here to tell you that you're going to die tonight for what you did to my mother. You worked her to death in 1848 while I was in California, building the fortune I thought would buy her freedom. 12 years she's been in the ground while I've been working to save her, and now you're going to join her." The response from James Whitmore revealed both the patriarch's fundamental inability to comprehend that enslaved people's suffering mattered and his dawning understanding that Thomas possessed the will and the resources to kill them all, regardless of consequences. "Boy, Tom," Whitmore said with false calm that couldn't conceal his terror, "you're upset. I understand that. But your mother was just one slave among hundreds who have worked this plantation over the years. People die. That's the nature of life. You can't hold us responsible for natural death from old age and hard work. That's just how the world works." The laugh that escaped Thomas's throat was bitter and without humor, carrying 15 years of accumulated grief and rage that had been building since the moment he learned his mother was dead. "Natural death? Hard work? You worked her to death at 58 years old because you wanted to extract every last dollar of profit from her body before it gave out. And now you're going to experience exactly what she experienced, the knowledge that death is coming, that there's no escape, and that the people with power over your life don't care about your suffering." The systematic execution that followed as Thomas shot James Whitmore, then Elizabeth, then hunted down the wounded sons who had tried to flee, represented justice delivered with the cold efficiency that 15 years of business success had taught him. He felt no satisfaction in the killings, no cathartic release of rage, only the grim certainty that this was necessary, that people who had killed his mother through systematic cruelty needed to die, and that sometimes justice required becoming the kind of person you had spent your life trying not to become. The fire that Thomas set after ensuring the Whitmore family was dead consumed Oakwood's plantation house with a fury that seemed almost supernatural, flames climbing the Greek revival columns and spreading through rooms that had housed 4 generations of wealth built upon human suffering. Thomas stood watching from a safe distance while enslaved people who had remained at the plantation emerged from their quarters to witness the destruction, some crying, some celebrating, some simply standing in silent witness to the end of the world they had known. The final act before Thomas fled north, knowing he could never return to California or to any life he had built, that he was now a murderer who would be hunted, was visiting his mother's unmarked grave in the slave cemetery, kneeling in the dirt and speaking to her about what he had done and why. "I came too late to save you," he said to the earth that covered her bones. 15 years too late, but I made sure they paid for what they did to you. I made sure Oakwood will never produce another dollar of profit from anyone's suffering. I'm sorry I wasn't here when you needed me. I'm sorry all that money and all that success meant nothing because it came too late." The aftermath of what became known throughout Georgia and the South as the Oakwood burning left 4 members of the Whitmore family dead, one of the state's most prominent plantations destroyed beyond recovery, and a manhunt for Thomas Freeman that would eventually fail because a wealthy black man with resources and Underground Railroad connections could disappear into free black communities throughout the North in ways that Georgia authorities couldn't trace or prevent. Thomas lived for another 43 years after his week of systematic revenge, dying in Canada in 1903 at age 75, having never returned to the California life he had built, but having established himself as a successful businessman in Toronto, where he spent his remaining decades helping other escaped slaves build new lives in freedom, while carrying the weight of both his mother's death and his own acts of violence. The immediate response from Georgia authorities to the Oakwood burning revealed both the determination to capture and execute Thomas for murdering a prominent white family and the practical difficulties of locating a man who had resources, intelligence, and assistance from networks that had been helping escaped slaves evade capture for decades. The state offered a reward of $10, an enormous sum that indicated how seriously Georgia took the threat of wealthy, free black people returning to destroy plantations and kill their former owners. But despite extensive efforts, investigators never came close to finding Thomas, who had fled north within hours of setting the fire and who had used his wealth to create a new identity in Canada where American slave catchers had no legal authority. The manhunt's failure represented a humiliating demonstration that Southern states' power to control black people had limits, that wealth and intelligence could allow someone to evade capture even when authorities were actively searching, and that the Underground Railroad networks that slaveholders had tried unsuccessfully to suppress for decades possessed the sophistication and reach to protect high-value targets like Thomas Freeman, whose capture would have been used as warning to others who might contemplate similar resistance. The broader impact of the Oakwood burning on Georgia society and Southern plantation culture extended far beyond the specific deaths and property destruction to create profound anxiety about the vulnerability of plantation families to revenge from formerly enslaved people who might return with resources. The case became part of pro-slavery propaganda that emphasized the supposed dangers of black freedom and education, with newspapers throughout the South publishing sensationalized accounts that warned of former slaves returning as wealthy terrorists to murder their former owners and burn down plantations. But enslaved communities throughout Georgia and beyond heard the story very differently, understanding it as proof that escape could lead to success that transcended mere survival, that wealth accumulated in freedom could be weaponized against the system that had tried to destroy you, and that sometimes justice for profound wrongs required violence that earthly law would never sanction. The tale of Thomas Freeman, the escaped slave who returned as a wealthy man and systematically destroyed everything the Whitmores had built, became part of the oral tradition that sustained enslaved people through the final years before emancipation. The 90 enslaved people whom Thomas had helped escape from Oakwood in the week before he burned the plantation reached freedom in Canada through Underground Railroad networks that had been paid premium rates to ensure their safe passage. These individuals and families settled primarily in Ontario, where they joined established communities of formerly enslaved people who had preceded them, and many maintained contact with Thomas in the years that followed, understanding that he had sacrificed his California fortune and his comfortable life to avenge his mother's death, while simultaneously liberating them from bondage. The accounts these formerly enslaved people provided to abolitionists and historians in later years created detailed records of both the Oakwood burning itself and the broader context of Thomas's revenge campaign. They described his systematic economic warfare against the Whitmores, his use of wealth to expose corruption and hire agents to deliver physical justice, his coordination of their mass escape, and finally the fire that consumed both the plantation house and the family that had profited from 4 generations of enslaved labor. These testimonies preserved Thomas's story when Georgia authorities were trying to suppress it, ensuring that his actions would be remembered not as terrorism, but as justice delivered by someone who had exhausted every peaceful option. The Civil War, which began just 6 months after the Oakwood burning, was interpreted by many formerly enslaved people as the ultimate vindication of Thomas's actions and proof that the violence he had deployed on an individual scale would eventually be deployed on a societal scale to destroy slavery itself. The parallel between Thomas burning Oakwood to punish the Whitmores for his mother's death and the Union Army burning plantations throughout Georgia during Sherman's march to the sea was noted by numerous observers who saw both as examples of justice that operated through destruction when moral suasion had failed. Union officers who interviewed formerly enslaved people during Georgia's occupation heard the story of Thomas Freeman repeatedly and incorporated it into their understanding of the depth of rage that slavery had created and the sophistication of resistance that enslaved people had deployed even before the war, provided opportunities for more open rebellion. Some Union commanders used the story when recruiting formerly enslaved men into black regiments, citing Thomas as an example of what black people could accomplish when given freedom and resources, and suggesting that service in the Union Army represented another path toward the same kind of justice Thomas had delivered at Oakwood. The fate of the Oakwood property itself, following the deaths and destruction, revealed how completely Thomas's revenge campaign had succeeded in ensuring the plantation would never again generate profits from enslaved labor. The land eventually passed to distant Whitmore relatives, who had no desire to rebuild or resume operations, particularly given that the burned plantation house had become something of a pilgrimage site for formerly enslaved people who came to see the place where Thomas Freeman had delivered justice and to honor his mother's memory by visiting the slave cemetery where Sarah had been buried. The property was sold multiple times over the following decades, with each successive owner discovering that the land carried a reputation that made it difficult to recruit workers or to operate profitably. By the 1880s, portions of the former plantation had been purchased by formerly enslaved families who established small farms on land where their ancestors had labored in bondage, a development that would have satisfied Thomas had he known about it. The slave cemetery where Sarah was buried was eventually converted into a proper memorial, with individual markers for those who could be identified through records and testimonies, including a prominent stone for Sarah herself that read, "Sarah, mother of Thomas Freeman, 1790–1848, who taught her son to read to survive and to remember that freedom must sometimes be won through fire." Thomas Freeman's life in Canada after the Oakwood burning represented both successful evasion of American justice and permanent exile from the California life he had spent 15 years building. He arrived in Toronto in late 1860 with enough hidden resources to re-establish himself, though never at the level of wealth he had achieved in California. He opened a boarding house catering to newly arrived, formerly enslaved people, then expanded into other businesses that served the growing black community in Ontario. He married late in life to a woman who had also escaped slavery, and they had 3 children who grew up knowing their father's story and understanding both the love that had motivated his revenge and the terrible cost that arriving too late to save his mother had extracted. The psychological burden that Thomas carried for the rest of his life involved not just the violence he had committed, but the knowledge that all his success had been meaningless because it had come 15 years too late. He spoke rarely about the Oakwood burning, even to close friends and family, but those who did hear him reflect on it described a man who felt no regret about killing the Whitmores, but who was haunted by the question of whether he could have done things differently, escaped earlier, accumulated wealth faster, found some way to save his mother rather than merely avenging her death years later. The interviews that Thomas gave late in life to researchers documenting the experiences of formerly enslaved people revealed a man who had found peace with some aspects of his past, but who never fully reconciled the tragedy of his mother's death with his own survival and success. "I spent 15 years building a fortune to save her," he told an interviewer in 1899, 4 years before his death. "Every dollar I made was for her. Every business success was meant to bring me closer to the day I could buy her freedom. And then I arrived and found out she'd been dead for 12 years, that all that sacrifice and all that accumulation had been for nothing. The revenge I took gave me some satisfaction, but it didn't bring her back. It didn't undo those 15 years of separation. It didn't change the fact that I wasn't there when she needed me most." The legacy of Thomas Freeman's story extended beyond his individual acts to influence discussions about justice, revenge, and the moral complexity of violence deployed against systematic oppression. Abolitionist speakers used his story as an example of how slavery created conditions that made extreme responses necessary, while pro-slavery advocates cited him as proof that black freedom led to violence against white people. Neither interpretation fully captured the tragedy at the story's core, A man who did everything right according to the rules of his time, who escaped slavery and built wealth through legitimate means, who tried to save his mother through legal purchase rather than dangerous rescue, and who discovered too late that patience and legality meant nothing when the people you were negotiating with had already killed the person you were trying to save. Modern historians studying the Oakwood burning have documented extensive evidence that corroborates the basic facts of Thomas's story, while acknowledging that some details remain unclear, given the secrecy surrounding his actions and the destruction of records when the plantation burned. Property records confirm the systematic debt purchases Thomas made, newspaper accounts document the fire and murders, and testimonies from formerly enslaved people provide detailed descriptions of the week leading up to the burning. What remains debated is whether Thomas's actions constituted justifiable revenge for his mother's death, or whether they represented terrorism that foreshadowed the kind of racial violence that would plague American society for generations. Dr. Marcus Johnson, a contemporary professor of African American history at the University of Georgia, has written extensively about the Oakwood burning and its significance for understanding resistance to slavery. Thomas Freeman's story challenges simplistic narratives about resistance and revenge. Dr. Johnson argues in his book, Wealth and Retribution: Economics of Resistance in the Late Antebellum South. He wasn't acting from desperation or hopelessness. He was a wealthy, successful man who could have stayed safely in California. But the discovery that his mother had died while he was accumulating wealth to save her created a moral crisis that he resolved through systematic destruction of everything the Whitmores represented. His actions were calculated, strategic, and devastating in ways that desperate violence could never have achieved. The descendants of those whom Thomas helped escape from Oakwood have maintained his story as part of their family histories, passing down accounts of the week when a wealthy black man returned to Georgia and liberated nearly 100 people while destroying the plantation that had enslaved them. They tell it not to glorify violence, but to honor the memory of someone who used resources that slavery claimed black people couldn't acquire to accomplish what the system claimed was impossible, and who proved that sometimes the most effective resistance comes from those who have achieved success, but who remember where they came from and who they left behind. The site of the former Oakwood plantation, now divided among multiple owners, including descendants of people who were enslaved there, maintains a memorial park that commemorates both those who suffered under slavery and Thomas Freeman, whose revenge ensured the plantation would never again profit from human bondage. The memorial includes the preserved foundation of the burned plantation house, the restored slave cemetery with individual markers, and a museum that tells the full story of Oakwood from its founding through its destruction. A prominent display features Thomas's story with emphasis on the tragedy of arriving too late and the terrible justice he delivered when he discovered that all his success had been meaningless because it couldn't save his mother. The incredible story of Thomas Freeman challenges us to grapple with impossible questions about justice, revenge, and the terrible price of success that comes too late to save the people it was meant for. If this tale of wealth weaponized for destruction, of systematic revenge delivered by someone who had every reason to stay safe but who chose violence over survival, has moved you or made you think differently about the forms that justice can take when earthly law provides no accountability, let me know in the comments below. Share this video with others who appreciate these extraordinary stories of people who refused to accept that some wrongs couldn't be answered, who used resources their oppressors never imagined they could acquire to deliver justice their oppressors never imagined they could face. Subscribe for more incredible true stories of resistance that operated through means both legal and illegal, peaceful and violent, patient and immediate. These are the stories that remind us that sometimes the most devastating revenge comes from those who have everything and discover that all their success means nothing because it arrived 15 years too late, and that grief channeled into systematic destruction can accomplish what law and morality will never permit. Until next time, remember that every fortune built on others' suffering is vulnerable to those who survive, escape, and return with resources and rage that can't be contained or controlled.